Welcome to Water Loss Audits, Lessons Learned. I'm Erin Jameson Koenig with AIM, and I'll be moderating this workshop today. Thank you for joining. If at any time you are having any audiovisual issues, please call the conference help desk at 317-237-6200, extension 232. You can also email aim@aimindiana.org. The last 10 minutes of the workshop session will be dedicated to Q&A. Please submit questions through the questions feature, which is normally on the top right-hand corner of your screen. If you are using a phone or iPad, you may see it elsewhere on your device. Please do not wait to submit questions. There can be a delay between the time you send questions and the time we receive them. This workshop is being presented by Andrew Gordon with Wessler Engineering. I will hand it over to Andrew now.
Thank you very much, Erin. I wanted to first extend thanks to AIM for having me present today, and wanted to welcome all of you to Water Loss Audits Lessons Learned. My name is Andrew Gordon. I am a project manager with Wessler Engineering. I'm excited to share with you today lessons I've learned from both my experience 4 years ago was first when the water loss audits came about as far as in the state of Indiana, and we are all in the midst of completing audits again as required by the state of Indiana. So I'm excited to be here with you today and to share some things that I've learned in my experience over the past, pretty much almost the past 9 months since December of last year, when these efforts for the water loss audits kicked off again, and also from my past experience from 2016. So as I mentioned, my name is Andrew Gordon. I'm a project manager with Wessler. Wessler is a civil engineering consulting firm based out of Indianapolis, Indiana, but we have some branch offices in Evansville and Fort Wayne and also in Ohio. I've been with Wessler for 17 years. My experience in the industry has been in the 18-year range, and I've had the opportunity, as I've mentioned, to work on some water loss audits 4 years ago when everything first started, and also in the recent times here, as far as all the utilities in the state of Indiana, basically preparing all their audits to get them submitted by the end of this year. I am grateful to have participated with some other cohorts of mine in this industry. I've had the opportunity to be a presenter and a co-instructor with the Indiana Finance Authority, who's driving the water loss audits efforts here in the state of Indiana, and also present with the folks from M.E. Simpson, from RCAP, and also from the Indiana American Water Works Association and the Indiana Rural Water Association, now one entity. But we've had workshops around the state ever since December of last year, and those workshops, there's been, I think, 12 of them total, and the last one will be coming up here in October. So anything that I can share with you today, I hope you benefit from, but I know that there's a bit more instruction needed if anyone wants to take advantage of that coming up here in October. So what I'd like to start off with today is an audit story that I learned and had experience with back in 2016. So back in 2016, the water loss audit concept for utilization by all the utilities in the state of Indiana came about, along with the infrastructure needs surveys. So the Indiana Finance Authority contacted all the utilities in the state, and they asked for information about their water systems for them to fill out information, and also to complete a water loss audit to gauge, kind of where the state of the water industry was with regard to non-revenue water in the state of Indiana. So one of the, I'm going to identify it as a central Indiana town. One of the towns that I worked with back in 2016, I met with, and they gave me some information, about their water system, to help me prepare the audit. And we got through the audit and found out that they had in excess of 50% non-revenue water in their water system. And for a utility to supply water and only sell half of it, it is quite a disadvantage, because they obviously don't have that revenue to put forth toward their utility to actually pump the water and actually sell the water. So the whole concept of water loss audits is to reduce non-revenue water, as much as feasibly possible, by identifying, where those areas are at that you can actually improve. So they based on the results, we determined that they had a 53.7% non-revenue water number. And some of the information that they gave us was they had a 100,000 gallon elevated water storage tank, and the folks in town said that operated the system told me that the tank was only half filling. So the thought is that they had something going on in their system that I don't think everybody knew the full story about or hadn't discovered yet. So the water loss audit actually brought to light that they had this much non-revenue water. So the town took it upon themselves to investigate their water system, and lo and behold, one day one of their personnel was out tracing the lines for the water main and came across some gushing water in a storm sewer in an inlet. And they discovered that water was flowing from one of their water mains that had broken into the storm sewer inlet and had never surfaced above the ground for them to see it. But they actually heard it. They located the leak. They fixed the leak. And once they repaired it, the next day their elevated water storage tank resumed expected levels of operation. They were able to fill their elevated water storage tank. So they fixed what's called a real loss. They had a real loss in their system, that they were pumping the water, but they weren't being able to sell it. And that is an advantage of the water loss. This the whole point in my story is that if they hadn't done a water loss, they might not have realized that they had this much non-revenue water. So what are we going to cover today? There's a great reason, a purpose for doing an audit. Why are we doing one? I'm gonna discuss that. I'd like to touch on the audit software, the software that is published by the AWWA for use in completing water loss audits. This is the piece of or the tool that utilities will use to complete their audits. I'm going to talk about audit terminology, because there's a lot of terms and words that go into these audits that are not used on an everyday basis. So it's good to understand the audit terminology that's included in the software. I am going to talk about the parts of the audit. Grading your audit. There is an effort by the utility or the utility's representative that's doing the audit to grade it. So in addition to actually putting in the information, the grading will basically assign a rating as far as how comfortable you are with your answers, and that grade goes into play as far as how you can improve in the future as well. I'll also talk about some lessons learned in addition to all of the above bullet points. Those are also lessons that I feel were necessary to mention in this presentation, but there are specific lessons that can be that I've learned over the years that can be of use to utilities here in the remaining months before they need to submit their audit. And then I'll remind everybody of the submittal requirements for the audits as kind of a conclusion before we jump into questions. So why do a water loss audit? To answer that, in 2015, the Indiana Finance Authority launched their statewide water loss assessment, which was termed Wi-Fi, kind of a play on words, you know, with the whole Wi-Fi internet. But the Wi-Fi effort was paired with the infrastructure needs assessments that came out in 2015/2016. And what was found was that Indiana, after they received all the audits, Indiana had an annual non-revenue water total that was exceeded 50 billion gallons. So the water utilities in the state of Indiana pumped 50 billion gallons of water that they could not sell. And this resulted in an estimated 54 million in lost revenue. So that is a concern from the state's perspective, as far as, you know, how can these utilities recoup that money? You know, what efforts are needed to recoup that money, and what kind of efforts from the state can help utilities, you know, recoup that money. So this was all based from the requirement was based from the Senate Enrolled Act 4, which was in 2019. I'm sorry, in 2019 was when Senate Enrolled Act 4 came out, stemming from the efforts back from 2015 to 2016, and which required the 552 water utilities in the state of Indiana to submit an audit to the state. The audits will then be submitted to the General Assembly by the Indiana Finance Authority. And one of the main reasons for doing the water loss audits is to gauge where everybody is at in the state of Indiana as far as the utilities go, so that future dollars can be made and future assistance can be made to utilities to help them reduce their non-revenue water. It is important to note that community water systems that sell water to users using a meter are the entities that are required to do a water loss audit, because there has been some questions that I've received as, you know, do I need to do a water loss audit, you know, because I've only got, you know, this many customers, or, you know, do I need to do one because of this parameter? Well, that's the definition that the Indiana Finance Authority goes by. Communities, water systems that sell water to users via a water meter are required to do an audit. So with the audit, one thing that I've learned since 2016 and the recent efforts with the audits is that it's going to be a circular process. Utilities need to gather the data on a yearly basis of their water pumped and their water sold. Basically, it's a balance. You know, water pumped versus water sold. The difference between those two is what where the non-revenue water number comes from, you know, in a nutshell. So once the data is gathered, we enter that data. We enter that data using the water loss audit spreadsheet tool, which is the M36 water loss audit spreadsheet. Basically an Excel spreadsheet that has been published by the AWWA for use by water utilities to complete an audit on their water system. On odd years, which would be not this year, so this year is an even year, 2020. On odd years, the utilities in the state of Indiana are advised to complete an audit and save it locally for their use and their records. They don't need to have it the audit validated. They do not need to have anything done with it as far as submitting to the state of Indiana, to the IFA. They just need to do an audit. Now on even years, as in this year, they are to complete an audit and submit it to the Indiana Finance Authority and also have it validated. And the validation portion of the audit, as I'd mentioned, is basically a third party that comes in and who has no involvement with the audit itself, comes in and basically double checks the audit and checks the grading that's assigned to it, makes sure that everything is reasonable and follows the documentation that was used to put the audit together. So this is the circular process that is being advised to all the utilities in the state of Indiana as something to follow with regard to the requirements that have been put in place. This is all, as I'd mentioned, just a balance of water pumped versus water sold, and the difference is the non-revenue water number that we're trying to determine. So now I'm going to jump into the tools for completing the audit. As I'd mentioned, the main tool for completing the audit that will be the deliverable to the state of Indiana will be the M36 water loss audit software, which is an Excel spreadsheet. It has boxes for the utility to complete to enter your data. Those boxes are white. The boxes that automatically generate information are colored in yellow. And the data that the utility will need to gather starts with your finished water pumped. That's one of the first things that the utility is going to need to gather is the volume of finished water pumped. And the volume of finished water pumped can be from it needs to start from your finished water meters. So I have worked with some utilities where they pump straight out of their wells and they have no treatment. So their finished water meters would be at their wells. They would have 3 or 4 of them, or however many wells they have. If they have a meter on each one of them, then the summation of that meter data would be your finished water pumped. In contrast, the utilities that do treat their water, they often have finished water meters at their plants, and those were that would be another location of where you'd have your finished water, where you'd want to bring where you'd want to record your volume of finished water pumped. That is termed volume from owned sources in the audit spreadsheet. That information typically comes from that information. They keep track of that. The second bullet point is the volume of finished water sold. This often comes from the billing department. So this is a process here where it's not just one individual that's going to be doing the preparation of the audit. It's going to be more of a team effort. There's going to be multiple individuals that are likely going to have to pull this information. The third bullet point is the volume of finished water bought and or sold wholesale. So a water utility in the state of Indiana, I know that there are a number of them, oftentimes sell water to wholesale customers. You're going to want to include that as a separate number in the audit, in addition to your volume of finished water pumped. You're going to have water that you sell to your customers, and then you're going to have what's called exported water. You're going to have water that you export out of your system as a wholesale to wholesale customers. In contrast to that, there's also utilities that buy water. They have interconnections or whatnot with other systems for a variety of different reasons. They purchase water to supplement their existing water supply, or they purchase water solely from another water utility. So that is going to be some other data that the utility is going to have to gather for the audit. Water distribution system data is the next thing. Length of mains and number of service connections. How can a utility determine those? Well, length of mains can be determined using maps. Obviously, paper maps can be a basis. If a utility has paper maps, they can determine lengths of mains. A lot of utilities have progressed toward GIS maps, GIS systems, where a lot of that information is available in shape files and digitally can be obtained. So that is another route. Another route would be a hydraulic model of your water system. The length of mains can easily be Googled in a hydraulic model and determined that way. Number of service connections, that's another likely billing question. Number of service connections needs to include both active and inactive connections. Reason being is that water loss can occur in active connections or inactive connections. So you'll want to pay attention to make sure that you're getting the right number of service connections in your system for both active and inactive. The next bullet point is authorized consumption. Authorized consumption, the volume of authorized consumption is defined as how is your water used in your system? How do you bill for your water? And we'll talk about a little bit more on the parts of authorized consumption in some of my next slides here. And then lastly, cost data. Obviously, cost comes into play along with the actual operation of the water system. Operating costs, material costs, we'll talk about a little bit more about the factors that need to be gathered as far as the cost data for entering into the spreadsheet. So audit terms and definitions. I already touched on number one, exported water as far as wholesale water bought. But then the other term would be imported, any utilities that do buy water from other utilities, that would be termed as imported. So those are two terminologies in the water loss audit software where a utility will enter information if those apply to your utility. Authorized consumption, as I'd mentioned, we talk about it a little bit later. Here we are. Authorized consumption, there's 4 different types of authorized consumption. The first one, billed metered, is going to be the majority of your authorized consumption in your system, where you have physical meters in your water system and you know that you bill for them. So a utility, a lot of your residences, a lot of your businesses and things have a meter, so you have that meter kept track of, and you bill the water use through that meter every month. So that would be your billed metered authorized consumption. The next point is unbilled metered. And an example of unbilled metered would be some city buildings or parks departments, or maybe like a community or city swimming pool, where water is used and metered through put through a meter, but it's not billed for. You want to keep track of that information and enter that into the audit spreadsheet. Billed unmetered, an example of billed unmetered would be a customer that a utility charges a flat rate for, where you don't physically have a meter there, but you know that you bill something to it. So that contributes to revenue, but you may not have an idea of what they use per month or whatnot. But that oftentimes that water usage could be estimated as well. And then the lastly is unbilled unmetered. Examples of unbilled unmetered would be, for instance, flushing. A utility on a fairly annual basis is very common. Completes flushing operations in their systems to maintain water quality, especially at dead-end mains. Also, construction use. If you have a construction project, where a water main replacement or water main extension in your system, and you allow a contractor to fill a main and then flush the main, and that water would be considered unbilled unmetered. If you don't have a meter on the contractor's hydrant that they're using, or end of a water main, that could potentially be unbilled unmetered water use. Also, depending upon where if a utility has meters on their wells and they consider that finished water, but they also have a treatment plant, and the treatment plant is downstream of the finished water, likely they're using water for backwashing. So the backwash water would be considered in that example as unbilled unmetered. Number 3, unauthorized consumption. Unauthorized consumption is defined as illegally withdrawn water. So this is where you might have a customer, put in a jumper in a pit where, they basically, if there's no meter in there and they essentially steal the water by putting in a piece of pipe between the two ends of the meter yoke, and they can get stolen water pretty much. Also, hydrants. There has been instances where there have been individuals or companies that have hooked up to hydrants, in an unauthorized manner. Those kind of instances would be considered unauthorized consumption. There are, number 4, there's 2 types of real losses. Only 2 types. One is a physical leak, as the example that I shared at the beginning of my presentation, and the other is a tank overflow. Those are the only 2 real losses that can occur in your system. Then there's apparent losses, number 5. The apparent losses are a combination of unauthorized consumption, which we just talked about, customer meter reading inaccuracies, and systematic data handling errors. So unauthorized consumption we talked about. I'm going to give a definition of customer meter reading inaccuracies, and then also systematic data handling errors. I'm going to skip back here just for a minute. Customer meter reading inaccuracies would be defined as misreading a meter, obviously. If there is a meter read one month and the next month, the person is talking on their phone or whatnot, if it's read manually and there's an error with what they read, that would be considered an accuracy in meter reading. As far as the some of the result parameters in the water loss audit software, when you get your information inputted into the software, you will then be presented with results, and the results will include what's called unavoidable annual real loss and current annual real loss. I'll talk about those together. The unavoidable annual real loss is defined as the theoretical low limit of leakage. So based upon the inputs that you enter into your system, length of mains, number of service lines, a lot of the physical parameters of your system, the software generates a automatic or theoretical low limit of leakage, which is defined as the unavoidable annual real loss. So it's unavoidable. You cannot get any lower than that as far as a leakage in your system. You're always going to have leaks in your system, but this is the very low point that the software generates. The current annual real loss is defined as your water losses, your pumped minus your apparent losses. So jumping down to number 8, the infrastructure leakage index, the ILI is a good indication of where you are as far as what's the difference between your current losses and your unavoidable real losses. And the current annual real loss divided by the unavoidable annual real loss is what's defined as the infrastructure leakage index. And I'll touch base a little bit more about that a little bit later too. Systematic data handling errors, we kind of already talked about. Variable production costs is one of the last things I wanted to talk about as far as terms and definitions. Variable production costs are defined as costs to produce and supply the next unit of water. These are variable costs, so they're not something that is, steady every month. It sometimes varies per month based on, the time of year it is, or the water quality of the water being pulled out of the ground. Some utilities have groundwater wells as far as surface water. So there are varieties of, how a utility uses, and this goes to my second point under variable production costs, is how they use chemicals and how they use their electricity. So variable production costs are your treatment chemicals, the cost of your treatment chemicals. So your chlorine, your fluoride if you treat for fluoride, your polyphosphates, all of your chemicals you will need to include in that cost. And then also the electricity to operate and to pump the water to your customers. Those are the 2 main variable production costs that you'll want to include in that line item. If you purchase water, then the cost of importing the water can vary as well. So that's another variable production cost. So you want to include that as a item under the variable production costs. So covering the whole realm of the audit, I wanted to explain the parts of the audit as we've touched on already. This is a screenshot of a tab in the water loss audit software for the parts of the audit. So this is the water loss audit balance is what it's called. You start from the left-hand side of the balance or the chart, and you work your way to the right. And you basically start from your water pumped, you get into your water sold toward the middle, and then you evaluate your consumption as well as your losses, and that's what results in your revenue and non-revenue water. And this chart will be completed. You see all zeros in it right now, but this chart will be completed once you have all of your numbers and everything, all your grades and everything inputted into the audit software. So in addition to in addition to inputting the information into the audit software, you then have to grade yourself. So whether the utility is doing the audit input of data themselves or whether you're having somebody else do it, you have to assign what are called data validity grades, DVGs, essentially scores that the auditor or the utility will assign to each of the areas where they input information. And I've got an example here. It's pulled from the audit spreadsheet, and my example would be from one of the first things that you'll input would be from volume from owned sources. So we can go through just a quick example here. So let's just say that a utility has 1 out of 4 of their wells that are metered, and you need to assign a grade to it. Well, looking at the data validity grades for each of these items, it's going to be a 1 through 10 scenario, and you're going to grade yourself on a 1 through 10 basis. And if there is criteria, that doesn't apply, then you would select non-applicable, obviously. But in this case, if they had 1 out of their 4 wells metered, and that's all the information that they had, what would you end up picking as a grade? And so let's just say if we look at, it's going to be toward the lower end of this list. But if we look at let's say number 2, 25% to 50% of treated water production sources are metered. Well, we can accurately say that 25% of them are metered. Other sources are estimated. Well, yeah, we can say that that's true. No regular meter accuracy testing or electronic calibration is conducted. We don't know that based on what the example is. So in this case, depending upon if a utility had any knowledge of maybe they kept track of something as far as having another meter source on more than 1 well, then you would probably pick a 2. But in this case, with it being 1 out of 4 wells, I would say that they would probably be rating themselves a 1. In contrast, let's say for another example that all of your wells are metered, and each year you had them tested and calibrated on an annual basis to make sure that they were operating within the parameters that they needed to. So looking down the list, we would then be looking down 50, 75%, 75%, and then we get, oh, there's 100%. Well, 100% applies to how many meters we have that are in place for each of the wells. So jumping down, just the first one that catches my eyes is number 8. 100% of treated water production sources are metered. Meter accuracy testing and calibration is conducted annually. So yeah, thumbs up. That's where we're at as far as this example goes. Less than 10% of meters are found outside of plus or minus 6% accuracy. Well, if we know that information, great. If we don't, let's just say, for instance, that several of them tested maybe 7% accuracy. Well, then number 8 can't really apply to us. We need to jump back down to a number 7, because we know a number 6, we have greater than that 75% of water sources metered. So that's kind of the point that I wanted to get across, as far as lessons I've learned with this grading, is that you look for that condition that you can meet, and if you can't meet it, then you need to back it up, and you need to go further down the list, to select a lower grading criteria. After you've entered all of your DVGs into your audit, there is a data validity score that's generated, and the water audit, I've circled it here on the slide, water audit data validity score is basically the summation of the numbers that you entered. So as far as, if you put in, 1 for some and you put in a 7 for others, you basically the software adds all of those up and comes up with a data validity score. So I've seen utilities have, data validity scores down into in the 40s. I've seen them, up into the 80s. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're failing or you're thriving. It's just a score that basically gives you a snapshot of where your system is at, as far as on a 0 to 100 basis. And from that, underneath where I've circled here is the priority areas for attention. So there is information that's generated from the audit software, but which then presents, hey, if I'm at a 65, these are 3 areas that I can focus on in order to get up to that next level or raise my grades, higher the next time. So it actually gives you some input and some instruction as far as, what you could do to possibly raise your data validity scores. So jumping into lessons learned, not that we haven't covered lessons learned yet, but these are more specific things that I have found, working with a lot of folks around the state of Indiana, as far as, how they're doing their audits, and what is going to be beneficial for them completing their audits, and then also getting them validated too. So one of the big things that I found is to add comments. I've circled it here at the bottom. You can see it. It's one of the tabs in the audit software. Make sure to document, what you have done for your audit, because for 2 reasons. It's going to benefit you as a utility, because on the years when you don't have to submit anything and you're doing an audit, you'll know exactly what you did the year before. You'll know exactly, what where that number came from and how it was calculated, and who pulled that information. You can put all the information you want into the comments. The second reason and benefit for the comments is that I put on here, validators will greatly thank you, because they will not be calling you, multiple times and asking you questions, as far as where'd you come up with this, or, how did you determine this. They will be able to have all that information, in one place, and minimize how much questions that they need to ask in order to validate your audits on those even years that you submit your audits to the state. Second lesson learned, check your decimal points. A lot of the inputs in the software, for instance, like the volume from own sources, water imported, water exported, those are in million gallons. To have a number like I've shown here, a 25,962, maybe that's doable for a really, really large utility that sells a lot of water to a broad area of customers. But for the majority of the utilities in the state of Indiana, you're not going to have that magnitude of water, and it's as simple as checking your decimal places. Maybe this was supposed to be 25.962 million gallons of water. That is something I've seen as far as, the results that utilities are getting. They have a decimal point off, so it's throwing their whole audit off. So make sure to check your decimal points. I kind of hinted at, I've circled both water supplied and then also authorized consumption. You see the difference between, where the decimal points are at. Something good to check. Meter locations and length of service lines. This is another lesson learned as far as, what do I do in entering the information into these boxes? are customer meters typically located at the curb stop or property line? That's a question that I can see some utilities saying, well, I'm not sure, or, how is that better defined? Well, there's two pictures in the software, figure 1 and figure 2. One is for a house connection that has a meter at the curb stop, and one that does not, where a meter is inside the home. And our customer meters typically located at the curb stop or property line question is yes or no. And if you select yes, and in all instances in your system, I guarantee that not all of your meters are at the curb stop or property line. There's going to be instances where the main is across the street and you've got a service line that runs completely across the street, to a meter that may be either at the property line or maybe a little bit up into people's yards or inside the house. So oftentimes the answer to this question will be no. But there may be instances where the majority of your system, the meters are located at the curb stop or property line. You can answer that yes. If you answer that yes, it will not allow you to enter any length of customer service line, and it won't allow you to enter a data validity grade. Those will be assigned automatically so that you don't have to do it. If you answer the question no, then you should come up with a basis as far as, what would be a good average length of customer service line. And you can do that by records of your customers, as far as if you do keep records of how long your service lines are, or if you have a representative sample in your system, or if you have, as we've mentioned with length of service mains, if you have that information in a GIS database, you could probably pull that information and input an average length of customer service line. Does it have to be, to the single digit? Absolutely not. It just needs to be a fairly close estimate to what is most representative of in your system. Total cost of operating the water system. There are a number of things that go into the total cost of operating the water system, and these include, I've listed them down here at the bottom. Salaries, what do you pay your employees, their benefits, insurance, any administrative costs that go into operating your water utility. Obviously, operation, your material, your pipe, your valves, your hydrants, anything to do with maintenance. Also, utilities are ever in the mode of doing extensions and replacements, when it's financially possible to do so. Those numbers need to go in there. And then also, if you have a capital effort in your system where you have a bond repayment schedule in place, where you're paying off a bond for, let's say a project that you did 5 years ago, those costs, need to go into the cost of operating your water system as well. Customer retail unit cost is a big one. We've had a lot of questions, as far as, what do I calculate this? A lot of utilities say, hey, I've got a tiered rate structure. I've got, so many gallons, if they up to 1,000 gallons, we charge this, up to 5,000 gallons, we charge this. How do I come up with an average customer retail cost? Well, one of the easiest ways to do it, and not to have to mess with a weighted average with regard to your rates, your tier structure, would be to take the total billed metered sales of water in dollars. So everything for this audit for 2019 would be everything that you sold, the dollar amount in dollars, and you divide that by the total water sold. So the total water that was sold to customers, and then make sure that the units are in per 1,000 gallons. That will give you a customer retail unit cost that should, as a check, should be within the range of your tiered rate structure. Variable production costs are another. We talked about those already. Cost for treatment chemicals, cost for electricity, the amount of electricity it costs to pump your water to your customers. And then, if applicable, purchase cost of the imported water, if you purchase import water from a neighboring utility. And then also another one that can be included in variable production costs that I've learned is insurance claims. If you have a water main break that floods out somebody's house or causes damage to a business or somebody's property, and the utility is responsible for it, then those insurance claim costs can be included in the variable production cost line. Lastly, a good item to note as far as lessons learned, and I learned a lot more about this in 2019 than I did back in 2015 and 2016, was the performance indicator page, basically the results. 3 items that you'll want to look at, as far as reasonability is to, am I getting reasonable results based on the information that I input? Are apparent losses per service connection per day, real losses per service connection per day, and then also, as we talked about previously, the ILI, the infrastructure leakage index. The ranges of values that I've shown here on the page, 1 to 40 gallons for apparent losses, 20 to 100 gallons per real losses, and then not having an ILI less than 1 are good indicators of whether my water audit results are reasonable or not. And ILI cannot be less than 1 because you can't have a number less than 1, because that would mean that you have your real losses are below what your theoretical low limit would be, and that's not realistic according to the software. So you'll want to look for those 3 criteria. Kind of getting toward the summation of my presentation, I wanted to bring up this slide again as far as how the water loss audit cycle is circular. It's gathering data, making sure that you're gathering data, entering the data into the water loss audit spreadsheet once you've gathered everything you need. The majority of your time is going to be gathering the data, usually, especially on the first, or possibly second attempt at doing the audit, until you get into a routine. Entering the data doesn't take as long, and then paying attention to your odd years and even years. When do you need to submit the audit to the state? When do you not have to do it? When do you have to do a validated audit? When you have to have somebody else validate it, and when you don't. And the validation, as I previously mentioned, needs to come from a individual or entity that did not participate in the formation of the audit. They need to be completely separate so that it can be a true, honest evaluation of whether the audit documentation matches what you put into it. So submitting the audit. Originally, the state had a deadline of August 1st, 2020, and back, I believe it was either in June or July that Governor Holcomb extended that due date based on the pandemic that we are currently in, and the efforts that have halted some of the ability of some utilities to get this done in a timely manner. He extended that deadline to January 1st, 2021. So utilities in the state of Indiana still have time to submit their prepare and submit their audit to the state of Indiana with some leeway. I did want to point out that just to reiterate, make sure you complete the audit using the M36 audit software. That's going to be the universal tool that the state's going to look for as far as making sure everything's kind of consistent between utilities, and include your comments. Make sure to document what you did to prepare your audit. Once you have your audit done, have your audit signed and certified by a certified validator in the state of Indiana. I know that there's a number of validators in the state of Indiana that can be utilized to validate your audit. And then once you have a certificate of validation from the validator and your completed audit, that's what the utility will be responsible for submitting to the Indiana Finance Authority. And I've included the email here at the bottom of my slide here, where to submit that to. There is a water loss audit training, one last water loss audit training class and validator training class and exam that's scheduled in French Lick for October 14th through 15th. So I wanted to point that out. This is, I believe the 12th training in the state of Indiana that will occur, to assist with the utilities, with questions and whatnot. And also too, if you have interest in becoming a certified validator, you can participate in the training class and then sit for the exam. So I wanted to kind of end and add that I hope that the lessons that I've shared today have been informative to everyone, and also wanted to point out, come to think of it, that along with water loss audits, I wanted to make sure that everyone knew that risk and resiliency assessments are due December 31st, 2020 for communities that are 50,000 to 100,000 in population. So with that, I thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be able to present at the AIM conference this year and would be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you. I will shift to Q&A now.